You're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Financial Times reports TikTok's U.S. revenues hit $16 billion as Washington threatens ban. Parent company ByteDance on track to become world's biggest social media group with $120 billion in global sales. What's behind the U.S. attempts to ban TikTok? Well, for insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest books are entitled, I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne Reader, and Acknowledging Radical Histories. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So again, TikTok has hit $16 billion in sales in the U.S., where the viral video app that has hooked Gen Z users is at risk of being banned. Privately held ByteDance does not disclose its financial data. The company declined to comment on the financial figures. The data comes as TikTok's future in the U.S. is plunged into doubt as this week after the U.S. House approved a bill to force TikTok to be sold. Dr. Horne, how much of this focus on TikTok has to do with the fact that TikTok is not part of the Silicon Valley triumvirate of U.S.-owned social media companies? Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, this crisis involving TikTok illuminates and illustrates a number of troubling trends for U.S. imperialism. Number one, it reflects the hysteria about the People's Republic of China and its growing role in the political economy of planet Earth, including leadership in green energy. In fact, don't be surprised if the United States begins to abandon solar energy altogether, because if they pursue that area, they will be dependent upon solar panels manufactured by, guess who? The People's Republic of China. The same holds true with regard to Chinese growing leadership in quantum computing. We've talked on this program before about how, in terms of electric vehicles, BYD and NIO and all the Chinese manufacturers are eating the lunch of Tesla, not to mention their counterparts and peers in Germany, the United States, and Japan. This is a reflection of the fact that China develops more engineers than the United States by several orders of magnitude. It also represents the fact that the United States is finding it difficult to compete with China, and so therefore it's going to basically try to kneecap China. But it's not only this hysteria about China that is part of our discussion today. The role of U.S. imperialism, even in the capitalist world, is under challenge, or is perceived to be under challenge, I should say. And that's led to this companion decision to not allow Nippon Steel of Japan to buy a flailing U.S. steel manufacturer. And by the way, this has bipartisan support. Mr. Trump has endorsed Mr. Biden's initiative. And one might wonder, I thought that the mantra of U.S. imperialism was free flow of capital and free flow of information. The latter, of course, referring to the information circulated on the TikTok platform. But our audience should recognize that those mantras are only relevant when U.S. imperialism is in the driver's seat, unchallenged. And it's not just U.S. imperialism. You might have seen a companion story out of the UK about how Redbird Capital, which is helmed by Jeff Zucker, the disgraced former leader of CNN, but backed by capital from the United Arab Emirates, is trying to buy the Daily Telegraph. Now, this thus far has been vetoed by the Sunak administration in London, but once again, it reflects a kind of hysteria, and it also reflects how the so-called Anglo-American axis sees capitalism and imperialism as a one-way street. That is to say, it's for them and their corporate comrades to dominate. But with regard to the street running in the other direction, not so much. The problem is that this particular initiative, this particular outlook is really not sustainable. It's going to handicap U.S. imperialism, the Anglo-American power's ability to compete with China. And of course, I could have added to this saddening litany all of this loose talk about confiscating $300 billion in Russian assets in the North Atlantic cap, supposedly because this capital will be redirected to reconstruction in Ukraine. Now, I guess they've disregarded the knock-on effects, how the Saudis and others might be reluctant to store capital in the North Atlantic cap if it can be seized in such a cavalier fashion. I guess they are not calculating the perhaps downside risk on the strength and potency of the U.S. dollar when it dawns on the investor class globally, how your assets can be at risk. But once again, I think this is part of the delusion that's now a permanent feature, apparently, of the ruling elites of the North Atlantic camp, and also the hysteria that has been generated by their camp losing altitude vis-a-vis the People's Republic of China and its comrades in BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, now joined, as you know, by Egypt, Ethiopia, Saudis, UAE, and Iran.
I did want to ask you one question, and I've been following this for a while. There was an article back in November from Representative Mike Gallagher. Why do young Americans support Hamas? Look at TikTok. Wilmer and I reported this a week. Jonathan Greenblatt, I think he's with the ADL or APAC. I think the ADL has been saying it's TikTok is really, bad for Israel, and they're using that. There was a recent poll that showed, on TikTok, and it was the number of views. And the bottom line was the number of views, Free Palestine was way up there at the top, right? It seems to me that part of this also seems to be a push to stop. And of course, a lot of young people use it. And of course, a lot of young people are opposed to what's going on right now in Gaza. It seems to me that that is a significant factor because they were talking about that before this TikTok ban thing started, or shall we call it the foreign adversary? It's not even really a TikTok ban because it says nothing about TikTok. It's more like the Patriot Act. And anyway, your thoughts on this, Dr. Horne?
Well, there is obviously something to what you say. And I think that it also reflects not only U.S. imperialism hysteria about ultimate control of the means of production and the flow of capital and the flow of ideas, but also control of the means of communication. Before he flip-flopped, Mr. Trump had suggested that TikTok is not alone with regard to real and imagined offenses. He, of course, pointed to Facebook in particular, and he probably had in mind Snapchat as well. But I think that Washington, like the Supreme Court, when they handle a case before them, they're also looking at the ramifications for the next case. And so by seeking to crack down on TikTok, Washington is looking at future confrontations with China, future confrontations with regard to who is in ultimate control of the means of communication. But what Washington should recognize is that, once again, they're setting an ominous precedent, because if TikTok can be driven out of the U.S. market, why can't Tesla be driven out of the Chinese market? And of course, I could go down the list in terms of Starbucks and Microsoft and Apple and all the rest that are heavily dependent upon the Chinese market. But ominously, it seems that Washington feels that it has enough military muscle to impose a double standard even on the world's second largest economy. I dare say that that is euphemistically a misplaced optimism.
Well, if the United States can't really manage Ansar Allah in Yemen, and Ansar Allah has just tested a hypersonic missile. I think your point is incredibly well taken. You know, you mentioned that the West views capitalism as a one-way street for its benefit. And when you said that, what immediately came to mind is that the Tony Blinkens of the world have implemented the rules-based order as the military slash so-called diplomatic means of supporting that one-way capitalism.
Well, indeed, but Rubio, which incidentally obviously matches the name of the senator from Florida, perhaps not coincidentally, is obviously a concoction of Washington. They do not talk about international law because, of course, if they talked about international law, it might cause them to reflect more deeply upon what's happening as we speak in Gaza. And by the way, I'm sure that you gentlemen in your audience have paid careful and close attention to the recent remarks of Senator Schumer, senior senator from New York, who on the Senate floor rebuked Prime Minister Netanyahu. And of course, in the White House Oval Office meeting with the Irish leadership today, Mr. Biden conceded that he consulted with Mr. Schumer before his remarks and apparently had input into the speech where he called for new elections in Israel and in fact called for a dislodging of the leadership of the Palestinian Authority as well. I guess he thinks that he and not President Biden holds this alleged title of being emperor of planet Earth, which of course even Mr. Biden does not hold. But I think that what that speech revealed is not only arrogance, a la the so-called rules-based international order concoction, but also the deteriorating position of U.S. imperialism and its allies in Israel. Understandably, we've been transfixed by the tens of thousands of casualties in this plausible genocide, to quote the words of the International Court of Justice with regard to what's happening in Gaza. But in the longer term, I'm afraid to say that the geostrategic implication is a significant defeat for Israel. Elon Pape, a scholar of Israel with whom you may be familiar, has said that we're witnessing the beginning of the end of the entire Zionist project. If that proves to be correct, this will cause a severe adjustment for U.S. imperialism, which has relied upon this unsinkable aircraft carrier in West Asia to carry out its diabolical schemes. Recall that a younger Mr. Biden said that if Israel did not exist, we'd have to invent it. That is, the U.S. imperialism would have to invent it because precisely of its importance in the military and geostrategic sense. But now, with a good deal of northern Israel being abandoned because of the conflict with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, with regard to a good deal of southern Israel being abandoned in the wake of October 7th, we've seen a de facto shrinkage of the borders of once mighty Israel. And you mentioned Ansar Allah in Yemen, which has imposed stringent military sanctions on Israel by seeking to halt vessels headed to the Israeli port of Eilat that traverse the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. So you see an incredible shrinking country, speaking of Israel, which it seems to me drove the remarks by Senator Schumer, but also, as the historian Elon Pape has suggested, it won't be a walk in the park if his premise that we are witnessing the beginning of the end of the Zionist project comes into fruition, because that makes Israel all the more dangerous. But the problem for U.S. imperialism is that they would like to focus on the People's Republic of China, but are finding that difficult as long as the Democratic Party, and to an extent the Republican Party as well, is heavily dependent upon campaign donations from Zionist billionaires. who, of course, are the major supporter of the Zionist lobby, which has in the crosshairs, as we speak, a number of members of Mr. Biden's own Democratic Party, speaking of Cori Bush of St. Louis, Andre Carson of Indiana, Summer Lee of Western Pennsylvania, Jamal Bowman of Bronx, Westchester, coincidentally enough, all members of the Congressional Black Caucus. It would be quite courageous for Senator Schumer to call off the dog with regard to AIPAC attacking members of his own party.
Mm-hmm.
And in any case, with regard to Senator Schumer, it seemed to be faux courage because he made all of these inflamed remarks, but he didn't sign on to cutting arms aid to Israel
or calling for an end to the war. He just talked about when it ends, as though, you know, who knows whenever that will be. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly appreciate it. Have a great weekend. We look forward to having you back.
Thank you.